And for the third session of the day will be the English session. Please feel free to listen English, okay? And now, the presentation is IP over DWDM, what IP folks should know. Please welcome Tashi Phuntsho from FLEXOPTIX.
Sorry, I've had a slow start. A bit wounded, it seems, today. My name is Tashi. Hi, I'm from FLEXOPTIX. I'm based out of Brisbane. I'm one of the orange guys in this part of the world. But while I was writing this IP over DWDM and thinking it from an IP folks point of view, I remember in my early days at Bhutan Telecom having to build POPs in remote parts of Bhutan using E1. Is it 20 minutes for me? Oh, okay. Remote parts of Bhutan. So IP over something is not a new thing, right? Those days we had to build IP over T1s and E1s using HDLC like framings. Then there came a next generation stuff called SDH. Then we had to do packet over SDH or packet over SONET. Initially we started with microwave SDH, then it became optical SDH, and then came DWDM where capacity was not an issue anymore because you could carry multiple colors of light on a single fiber, right? And recently, over the last 2 or 3 years, we keep hearing this IP over DWDM. So what's the promise? This is what we do typically at the moment, right? You have a very expensive piece of item called the transponder, which hands over a gray to your router or switch, and that's carried over your line system. So this is a typical multi-layer separate IP and underlying DWDM transport. The promise is this. The promise is, can we remove or get rid of this very expensive custom-built optical engines called transponders, come up with a standardized way of coming up with maybe plugs that can directly go into our routers and switches, which means wavelengths should be able to come out of our routers or switches directly onto the line system. And the whole idea is, can we simplify the network architecture so you end up with a consolidated IP and an optical network. Some people also tend to call it routed optical network. You can call it whatever you want, but the idea is to simplify the architecture. And that's where you want to pause and see what makes it possible, right? There are some fundamentals. What makes it possible? The most important one is coherent optics became pluggable. If you look at a 400 gig or 800 gig coherent plug, it's smaller than this clicker, right? It now goes directly into your routers and switches. Look at that this is just for context, right? That's a 100 gig transponder card, which is as big as my laptop, consumes 90 to 150 watts. To a modern coherent plug, whether it's 400 gig or 800 gig, you consume up to 23 to 30 watts. So the power per bit comes down quite significantly, and more importantly, you don't have the specialized optical engines where you need to pay so much. You have a very standardized, standard-based plug, which means it works on the idea, at least the principle is it should work across all the hosts, right? So for those of you who are not familiar with coherent, especially the IP folks, if there are optical people, please forgive me, right? But this is mainly targeted towards the IP folks. Coherent optics, just a quick recap, we use multiple properties of light. People call it higher order modulation, but what we do is we not just use the brightness or amplitude of the light, we also try and use phase, right? The phase difference of the light to encode more data. The idea is if I can encode more, if I have more properties of light, I can encode more data, which means I can carry more data. The biggest problem, of course, is not how much data I can encode, but how far I can also go with the bit rate that I want. So what we do, we rely on, again, polarization, another property of light, and say, okay, let me send 2 independent polarizations of light which don't interfere with each other, right? So here is an example of how we build a 400 gig coherent plug, right? So you have a signal that comes at about 60 gigabaud at 75 gigahertz. 16 QAM is one modulation technique where you can encode 4 bits per symbol, which means I can achieve about 240 gigabits. Throw that across 2 polarizations, you can double that to 480 gigabits. But then I just wanted to highlight there is an overhead. There is no such thing as free lunch. It seems even when we go for lunch here, where's your coupon? Same applies here. Because for 400 gig Ethernet, we need only about 425 gigabits. The remaining 55 gigabit is an overhead that we consume for forward error correction. Right? Because when you're trying to carry 400 gig or 800 gig over hundreds of kilometers, there will be bit errors, there will be OSNR degradation, and to correct that, you need forward error correction. Right? So the first one was, okay, plugs became pluggable. Second thing, the most important one is open standards and disaggregation, right? OIF started the 400ZR, I think opened up the whole thing where they were the first one to push for interoperable coherent plugs across different vendors. Then OpenROADM came up with this concept of, okay, we should be able to carry alien waves across different line systems. So they came up with this. They were the ones who pushed for a disaggregated transport, right? And then OpenZR Plus pretty much took the best of 2 and said, why only stick to DCI style of 400ZR? Why not we take this whole concept for long distance regional communication also? So that's 400ZR Plus, right? So we went to a very open, interoperable multi-vendor system, which is easy for IP to consume. Typically, our transport, even when I was in Bhutan Telecom those days, transport is a very vertical, single vendor thing, right? So what it means is, it should allow us to, it democratizes things, right? Disaggregation allows me to have, even those plugs on the head end, each of those plugs could be from a different vendor. It should work. Right? It shouldn't have to be only from one vendor, those coherent plugs. Your line system, each component of the line system could be from different vendors, yet they should interoperate, they should work. So that's the whole idea of disaggregation. Right? It's one thing for our plugs to be pluggable into a router or a switch, but can the router or the switch as the host manage and control the plug or not? So for that, we have a standardized common management interface spec. And for coherent plugs, we have an extension to that called the coherent CMIS. Again, the whole idea is this plug should be portable across any vendor or any platform. And for that, we have defined a standardized way of doing it, CMIS, right? What that means is for IP folks, this is the visibility we now get on our routers and switches. In the old days, with our typical multi-layer topology, we never know we don't even know, we don't have visibility of what's happening on the optical side. Until things fail, my IP side doesn't pick this, but these are now things that I directly see on my routers and switches, which means, as an IP guy, I am able to react a bit quicker before things fail, right? There are those parameters, these are telemetry information that comes to me, which means I could do some automation work and say, hey, if it hits this kind of threshold, maybe you want to reroute traffic across to this, right? So it allows you to do that. In a way, we now have some form of consolidation between IP and optical management, right? Just a quick recap, what is OSNR? It's the quality of signal. For IP folks, all you need to know is high OSNR is better, right? It means the signal is clean. If I'm a receiver, I'm able to easily detect the signal. That's why higher OSNR is better. This is a very well-behaved room. The OSNR is not 0 dB. 0 dB is if I'm talking, you are talking, I think then the signal-to-noise ratio becomes 0 because we are both equal. So you don't want a 0 dB OSNR, right? Now, quickly going through, your OSNR directly affects your bit errors, right? Remember I said higher OSNR means a cleaner signal, easier to detect, which means less bit errors, right? A lower OSNR means it's a very degraded signal. It's very difficult for me to detect the zeros and ones, which means it results in more errors. Right? And to put things into perspective, here is a 16-QAM constellation diagram. You see the first one, a really clean signal. I can clearly make out each of the points in the constellation diagram, come down to a noisy signal. If I'm the receiver, I pretty much give up, but I don't know. It's very difficult to detect and decode things from this kind of simple. So the third reason why IP over DWDM is possible now is you look at, there are FEC algorithms have gotten better, right? The early 400ZR relied on what's called CFEC, concatenated FEC, right? And it was really good for a DCI style of inter-data center connect, not a long distance one, which meant it used a combination of soft and hard decision FEC, which means the DSP can be simple, it consumes less power, but it really can't go much. It's not too tolerant to noise, which means you really can't do longer distances with that. Then came 400 Zera Plus, multi-source agreement MSA, where we now have OFEC or OpenFEC, which does more soft decision FEC, which means it can tolerate more noise, right? The fact that it can tolerate more noise means I can go a bit longer, a bit further with that. And also it allows you to multi-rate. Multi-rate meaning if the link is so bad, instead of doing 400 gig, I have the option to come down to 300 gig so that I tolerate things a bit better. If that doesn't work, come down to 200 gig, come down to 100 gig. So multi-rate, right? The other thing that has come up is a new DSP technique called PCS, or probabilistic constellation shaping. The idea is typically without PCS, now just a fundamental, the distance from the origin to a constellation point is how much energy I consume to transmit that point, right? To transmit that signal. Which means points that are outside or further away from the origin consume more power, points that are closer to the origin consume less power. So the inner points consume less, the outer ones consume more power. So what PCS does is, instead of the high and low power points being consumed equally, what PCS does is it ensures that I consume the lower, I try to send as much as possible the low energy inner constellation points more often than the high energy. This, why it matters operationally? It means my required OSNR is lower, which means again, a lower OSNR requirement means I can go a bit further, right? So with that concept, now with coherent plugs across different scenarios, you should be able to use them. If you have a dark fiber, you should be able to do it as an unamplified point-to-point link. Even if you have a DWDM with maybe amplified only as boosters and preamps, you should still be able to run that. And if you have a full-fledged DWDM network, you should still be able to run that and go thousands of kilometers. Just a few quick examples. This is something that we did with DKIX in Frankfurt. This was the first IP over DWDM that we actually deployed about 3 years ago with them. The distance is not much. That time it was the first generation of the 400 gig ZR. That's why you see the launch power is only minus 10 dBm. It's a very low launch power. One thing I wanted to point out of that experiment that we did was, that was using a Nokia 7950 box, and because it was early days of coherent plugs being tried, there's this concept called opcode, and then the OS was picking a wrong operational code. But for IP folks, this is what I wanted to talk about, which is instead of you configuring what's on the line side, what's on the host side, coherent plugs expose what's called the application mode or application code, which means it tells you what modulation schemes it uses, what FEC algorithms it uses, right? What's the baud rate, what the shaping looks like. So me as an IP guy, instead of me having to configure each of those parameters, you can actually go selectively pick which application code to use, right? There is an example of Juno S and iOS XR, the two OS that I'm familiar with, where you can actually go set this. This is from the Himalayas. This is Bhutan's Research and Education Network. This is a link from the capital down to border town with India. It's a very old fiber. It's an OPGW fiber, almost a 30-year-old fiber. And those were, for this POC, it was a Cisco box. It was the ZR plus coherent plug with a 1 dBm launch power. And there was also boosters and preamps. Right? And the theoretical calculation that I did for this POC before we actually plugged it in, it looked really positive. Oh, don't worry, the OSNR had about 7 dB margin. And this was the reality that we had. The OSNR is really touching the threshold. The threshold is 26 dB, and then the OSNR was floating around 24.9, 25 dB, which means we were really close to the threshold. And this is where your theoretical calculation is one thing, but knowing how old the fiber is, how the quality of the fiber also matters. And perhaps in hindsight, maybe we shouldn't have used boosters. We should have just used preamps on both sides. Because problem with boosters, you amplify noise also all the way. Noise, once you insert noise, you can't remove noise. So perhaps we should have just used preamps so that you don't amplify noise, but you amplify the signal at the RX side. Hindsight is a beautiful thing, right? Again, for IP folks, you see this parameters, this telemetry called Q factor or Q margin. Again, back to what OSNR was about. Your Q factor quantifies OSNR. It means higher Q factor means the signal is much clearer, right? Which means less errors. And Q margin is, now remember I said forward error correction can help you correct errors, but FEC can only do so much, right? If your OSNR drops below a certain threshold, so much errors get generated, your forward error correction can't help. So Q margin actually indicates to you that how much more can you let the signal degrade? How much tolerance does the system have, right? So that was an example of how we did point-to-point DWDM. But for long-haul IP over DWDM, I think the biggest problem will always be the fact that you need to amplify, and the fact that when you amplify, you also amplify noise. So OSNR, it declines gradually, right? So you might need to factor out how many inline amplifiers you want, how far off you want to space them, what level of gain you want on each of those amplifiers, and what kind of noise figures you want on those amplifiers, right? Because OSNR will be your biggest problem. Now with modern coherent plugs, remember I said we can now multi-rate. So if you have a very bad or marginal link, maybe you might want to come down to a lower bit rate, which will have a better OSNR tolerance. Right? Here is a theoretical example again of if you had a 400 kilometer span and you had that many amplifiers, what it looks like. But again, this if you look at the parameters that I've taken, I assume very good fiber. You assume that the noise figure is not too high. It's sitting somewhere at 5 dB. So suggestion is do this, but I think what matters is what is your fiber actually, the quality of your fiber. Now, if you have a full-fledged DWDM network and you have ROADMs already there, for you to do IP over DWDM, the biggest problem will always end up becoming what's the input power requirement of your current line system, right? ROADMs typically need -3 dB to 0 dBm, right? So if you have the old 400 ZR coherent plug which can only do -10 dBm, it can't integrate with your ROADMs if you have existing ROADMs. The problem is, yes, to integrate you might need to amplify only that particular channel, then you have equalization issues across your network. So that's the reason why you might want to actually go with ZR+, right? Because the modern 400 gig high power coherent plugs, they have a launch power from -5 dBm to +3 dBm because there are inbuilt mini EDFAs or silicon amplifiers inside. Right? So I think that's one thing that we need to take care of, and which means, since you are IP folks, maybe this is already being run by your optical team, which means you might need to sit down with them and discuss details before you just go plug in a coherent plug on your side, because you need to make sure that the current ROADM can handle it, you can make sure that the filters allow you, make sure that your line system allows the alien wave, because any color or wavelength that comes out from your coherent plug, which is from your router port, is alien to that line system, because it didn't come out of their system, so hence the term alien wave. So make sure your line system can or allows alien waves, right? And common sense also should matter. I think that's what the last bullet point is saying, that is every route a pluggable route? It may not be a pluggable route. If you have a very long distance link, a very bad fiber, or very challenging segment, maybe you need to stick with embedded optics, not go with coherent pluggable optics, right? Because with embedded optics, given the form factor, they don't have the same thermal limits that a QSFP DD or a OSFP coherent plug might have. Remember, coherent plugs go into your routers and switches. That's why they have thermal limits, right? You can't just keep consuming so much power and melt your whole switch and router. But with embedded optics, these are purpose-built transport equipments. They have higher tolerance. You can run those algorithms a bit more aggressively, right? So embedded optics still have their place. Right? What else to consider? Power and cooling. Okay? Remember the 400 gig optics that I showed, the ZR Plus high power optics that can do 0 dBm. What is 0 dBm? It's 1 milliwatt. How much is 1 milliwatt? 0.001 watt. That optics consumes 23 watts. So for my launch signal, I actually need only 0.001 watt. 99.99% of the power that I consume is consumed by the DSP and lost as heat, right? So that becomes a major problem. And remember, this one plug only goes into one port. So if you have 30 ports or 36 ports, you might need to consider, do I want to populate all the ports, or do I want to play with alternate ports? You know, look at the port D ratings that are there, and also make sure that can my cooling system handle this, right? And of course, because of the extra heat, it requires extra cooling, which means you might need to go augment your power system to say, for this extra cooling, do I need extra power, right? Okay, other considerations, again, this are common sense checks, right? Does the plug actually fit into the device or not, the host? But more importantly, although in principle, understanding is all these platforms, vendor devices, be it Cisco, Nokia, Juniper, whatnot vendors, whichever poison you pick, those poison should all be standardized, right? CMIS application modes, they should all be supported. At least that's in principle, but please, before you just go blindly assume that, do a POC, test it out, right? Some of them might do it based on the standard, some may have different, because a standard is one thing, how I interpret and write a code against that standard is a different thing. So you might want to do that. The other side's network management. Now that you receive so much information, coherent telemetry, onto your routers and switches, what are you going to do with it? Do you have a system that can consume those and react based on those telemetry that you receive? Oh, it's good to see them, but if you don't do anything, what's the point? And the transport people are always known to push for sub 50 millisecond switchover, right? So maybe you could also come up with some automation tools where you go like, oh, if my OS now drops below this and the queue margin looks like this, and on the interface, if there are a few packet drops, maybe do this. So you could define those kind of logic. Depends what kind of model-driven or event-driven automation tools you have. If you have a classic NMS, I don't know what you can do with this, the amount of information that comes to you, right? And this shows it's no more just labs and talk, right? These are some of the latest deployments, and I have tried to do commercial networks and RNE networks here. The one done by ARNet, Australia's oldest research and education network, stands out. They did Sydney to Perth to Singapore loop back 4,600 kilometers using 400 gig ZR++, which is ultra long haul. It uses a very different modulation technique. Hey, very aggressive testing, very long distance testing, but it's good that it was a proof of concept that it works. Closer to this region, Beaconix, where is NAN? NAN recently went live with unamplified data center interconnect between two of his POPs using a 400 gig ZR+. No amplification, nothing. Over a 40 kilometer link, and you have a live IP over DWDM network interconnecting two Beaconix POPs here. Drukren in Bhutan, this was just one span, and thanks to this, now there is a whole national backbone redesign going on where they might run at least 2 to 4 400 gig wavelengths across the whole country, but directly on routers and switches. But don't throw away your DWDM components, right? Throw away the transponders, but keep your muxes, keep your amplifiers, because you can reuse them, right? Who should consider? If you have your own fiber, definitely you should consider. If your bandwidth is above 100 gig, if it's going towards 400 gig, the aggregated bandwidth, maybe you should consider this, right? But I think this matters going forward, because you, like I said before, so much of information now, your optics gives you so much of information. IP folks, you need to understand optical concepts too, at least some fundamentals, right? So that you know what to do with it, you have to do with that information. Generally, transport and IP teams don't want to, oh, it's very territorial. You might need to break that territorial boundary and say, let's work together when you're troubleshooting things or designing things now. And hopefully disaggregation continues, which means, like I said, if I have a switch with 12 ports, I should be able to use 12 different coherent plugs from 12 different vendors, plug it in, it should still work. Right? So that's the hope with disaggregation, right? Thank you so much, that's my talk.
Thank you, Tashi. Any question? Anybody? Okay, Tashi, if you have any question, you can meet Tashi at FLEXOPTIX booth in front of the room. Okay. For the next topics, we will go to DNS. Next topic is promoting DNS operational and security best practices. Please welcome Champika Wijayatunga from ICANN.
Swadee Kap, good afternoon. So, first of all, I want to thank the forum, the ThaiNOG forum, for giving us the opportunity to do this presentation. And also, thank you everyone for joining us with this session. So my topic is going to be DNS, as it was mentioned. I'll be talking about the operational best practices, especially in the focusing security, and as operators, what you can deploy, what are the best practices, and also I want to touch on a framework that we have, what's called kindness, right? So these are, some of the things that I want to discuss during this presentation. I work for ICANN. I hope that you have heard about ICANN before. So ICANN is the body that coordinates mostly, the internet identifiers around the world. So, but of course, in this presentation, our focus is mostly on the DNS side. Right? Now, speaking of the DNS, I think it is clear to you that this is how the DNS queries would work. So if you are a client, your query would go from your client device to a resolver, and typically operated by your, the network operator, basically. And then the query would go to the authoritative name servers out there. Now, when you speak of the authoritative name servers, we have top of the DNS is the root name servers. And in fact, I can also operate one of the root name servers, the L root, and there are 12 root server operators in the world operating 13 letters. And then the queries would get into the resolvers, and the resolvers would go and talk to the top level domains, and then the second level domains, and then the resolvers would get the response and then given back to the client. And these answers are cached in the recursive resolvers. So this is typically, the query process that we have in DNS, but only thing is that query resolved does not really mean that it's all secure, right? It is understandable because there could be lots of risks that can be involved. Say, for example, if you are a resolver, and if you're going to talk to an authoritative name server, you don't really know whether you are talking to the right authoritative name server, right? So someone could be impersonating yourself, or there could be things like cache poisoning happening, right? Or if the authoritative name server is going to respond with certain answers, those answers can be modified in the middle. So the integrity of the data is also something that we don't, we have to make sure that it happens as well, right? So these are, a number of risks that are involved in this query process. So resolving a query does not really mean that it is secure. So this is why it is very important, especially as network operators, that you follow the best practices and try to deploy those best practices. I also want to actually quickly talk about the root zone management, because especially from ICANN's perspective, this is how it basically that happens. And especially if you are a CCTLD operator here, you also have to kind of be aware, especially if you do some changes to your CCTLD zone, make sure that update goes to the root zone, right? Otherwise, in fact, there are some inconsistencies that could happen. Say in your TLD zones, you might be having some certain information about your name servers, which may not really reflecting in the root zone. So you have to make sure that these are consistent. So what really happened is that the TLD manager, so if anyone here who are managing the TLD zones, you need to send that change request to the IANA. So IANA is a function within ICANN. So IANA stands for Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. So IANA is the sort of operational arm of ICANN. So IANA would actually manage the root zone. So you would be sending that request to IANA, and then IANA would do that change there is actually a contract with IANA and VeriSign. So VeriSign is the one that manages the, maintains the root zone. So IANA will go through, do the verification checks and things like that, and then that would be, they will pass it to the root zone maintainer, which is VeriSign. So VeriSign will do that update to the root zone, and then they will basically publish the root zone. And after publication, the root zone has to go to the root zone operators, because I told you that there are 12 root zone operators, and then they operate 13 root name server, basically names, right? If you are talking about root servers, don't get confused. I'm not talking about the root server instances here. If you're talking about root server instances, there are over 2,000 instances around the world. But we are talking about the root names, root server names, the letters. So there are from A to M, there's a certain convention, which is a.rootservers.net and b.rootservers.net, like that, all the way up to m.rootservers.net. So the root zone file goes to those operators, and then the operators would basically update their instances that they operate. So if you're talking about, say, for example, in Bangkok, there are a number of root server instances operated by different operators in Bangkok as well. And especially if you are from internet exchange points and ISPs, network operators, you can host these root servers. So you can talk to some of these root server operators, and you can have a root server in your network. So if you have a root server instance in your network, obviously your clients, and they can get better DNS response time as well. So and these are some of the things that, and then after that, of course, the resolvers would talk to these root name servers and get this information. So that's how the root zone gets updated, and especially, as I said earlier, what you have to know, especially if you are a CCTLD operator, make sure that if you do any change to your CCTLD zone, that you send a change request to IANA so that IANA can also update the root zone, right? The other thing, what I also wanted to quickly mention about that framework that I was talking about, which is what we call kindness, right? It stands for KINDNS, kindness. It is a long acronym. But we call it as kindness. So kindness is a framework where you can apply security best practices so that you can secure your DNS infrastructure. This is very similar to manners, right? You may have heard about manners during the workshops that you did before and so on. Even I think yesterday there were some references to manners as well during the yesterday session. So manners is basically for secure routing, right? You have guidelines to secure your routing infrastructure, whereas DNS is the same, pretty much the same thing, but for DNS security, right? So if you can follow the kindness practices, then you can basically, apply all these best practices in your DNS infrastructure. Now, when you think of the kindness, we are focusing on different operator categories. So you can see that there are a few operator categories here. There might be some operators who are authoritative server operators. So these are like, if you're operating any authoritative name servers, earlier we talked about CCTLD operators. You could be having, if you are ISP, you could be having your authoritative servers. Even if you are a corporate, you could be running your corporate authoritative servers as well, right? So whatever the case, you could be running some authoritative name servers. Now, when you think of authoritative name servers, the criticality changes, especially if you are a CCTLD, it's more critical, because if the CCTLD zone goes down, it will really impact the whole country, right? And it has happened in some countries. And especially even, not only the CCTLD zone, sometimes it could be a critical zone for your own country, maybe a government. For example, it could be a second level like gov.something, which is, where all the government entities are registered, they have their registered domains in that. So if you are managing any critical zone, if you're managing a top level domain zone, we have kind of more stricter sort of security practices where you may have to apply in your infrastructure. But if you are second level domains, you don't have to probably go into that extent of top level domains, but still it's always good to follow certain practices. When you think of resolvers, resolve operators, again, we can try to categorize those. There can be some closed and private resolve operators. They are like corporate resolvers. So you could be from a bank, you could be from a university. So you could be running your, corporate resolvers. They are basically closed and private resolvers. And also, then there is also this shared private resolvers. So these are like network operators, ISPs. You are basically, you have your own customers who will share your resolver. So you'll kind of fall into that category. And then we also have public resolvers. We know that there are many operators out there in the world who run public DNS resolvers as well. So if you operate any public resolver, then you can follow those practices in that category. So similarly, why we are having all these different categories, depending on the function that you do, depending on the service you offer, you can apply these different security practices. Then one of the other important aspect is hardening your core, right? So this is all, how you're going to get traffic into your core network and how you're going to get traffic out of that, and applying all those manners kind of guidelines, BCP 38, all those things. These are important, especially when you think of your core network. So these are things that basically through kindness, what we are trying to encourage. I've got kind of, put together, some of these practices. This is not the full list as such, but if you go to kindness.org, you can see these things in more detail. But I will quickly, tell a few things depending on the time we have. One of the very important things, if you're operating any authoritative servers, if you're operating any of those authoritative servers, if you are a CCTLD or if you are a second level domain or critical zone that you're operating, DNSSEC is something quite important, right? When you think of DNSSEC, DNSSEC stands for DNS Security Extensions. There are two aspects to that. Authoritative server operators, they should be signing their zones, right? Whereas resolve operators, they should be validating the answers that they are getting from the authoritative name servers. So depending on what type of DNS name servers that you operate, you may have to do either DNSSEC signing or you may have to do either DNSSEC validation. But from an authoritative server's point of view, what you have to do is DNSSEC signing. Now, speaking from the DNS hierarchical perspective, I told you about the root earlier. The root zone has been signed for quite a long time. DNSSEC has been deployed in the root zone since 2010. And so it's all fine with the root zone. And then if you talk about top level domains, around at the moment, over 90% of the top level domains in the world, they have deployed DNSSEC. So if there are any countries who has not deployed DNSSEC in your top level zones, this is something that you should be considering. When it comes to second level domains, the numbers, the percentages are still, it's quite less. It's around 10% worldwide if you consider the second level domains. But again, you have to understand that there are millions and millions of second level domains out there, right? Even if you take .com itself, there are over like 150 million second level domains out there. So, but still 10% of that, that means still a lot of domains, they have deployed DNSSEC. But if you have not deployed DNSSEC, this is something that you should be considering. Key management is, especially again, when you speak of DNSSEC, key management is again, something that you have to do very carefully, and also you have to put some effort into that. There are names, various utilities that you can do that, or you can automate these functions. One of the very important things, especially if you are if you're managing a critical zone or if you're managing a top level domain zone, you also have to have some good key management practices as well, because in DNS, this trust is being propagated from bottom to the top. So your, say the child zones, they will be sending the hashes of their public keys, so you have to actually manage those properly, right? So this is where the key management is very important when it comes to the DNSSEC. So there are some best practices around that. Zone transfers between the authoritative name servers. If you have some multiple authoritative servers running out there, you have to make sure those zone transfers are secure. Okay, so you should be doing things like, key-based authentications, which are, good practices. Zone file integrity, make sure that, if there are some changes that are happening to the zone file, those changes are kind of, you maintain the integrity, you have some certain mechanism to see, what sort of changes that have been done, revision controls, and things like that. Also, one of the other things I want to touch is a good practice. Some operators, they may put all your authoritative name servers, the recursive name servers, everything into the same infrastructure, which is really not a good practice. So you should always try to separate your authoritative name servers and the recursive name servers, right? So in that way, you can actually have some better redundancy. Minimum of 2 distinct name servers, at least 2, right? And then if you don't give 2, actually most of the DNS update would not happen. Authoritative servers, also for a given zone, you make sure that they're all running from a diversified infrastructure. Sometimes there are cases, even when you do some simple DNS queries, you may see that in some organizations or in some operators, all your DNS servers are running in the same subnet, possibly, right? I've seen that before. So don't put all your name servers into the same subnet, try to separate those. Even if you put into different subnets, make sure, they are in, different racks in different data centers, have that diversification, okay? So that's quite important. And also the DNS server software, right? If you are going to run a certain name server software, then also you have some diversity there. So don't run the same name server software across all your name servers. In some organizations, they do that. The same name server software is run in all their name servers. So if you can have some diversity there, that would also help. Again, DNS monitoring is also something that you should be doing. That's quite important so that you will know what sort of changes are happening. Now, those are some of the practices very important, especially if you are from an authoritative name server operator. But if you are from a recursive name server operator, earlier we said DNSSEC validation, right? So the recursive name servers, they are getting all those answers from authoritative name servers. So once they get the answers, they have to do the validation to check whether, basically, you are comparing the hashes and checking whether the answers are correct. And once, if it is validated, then the answer would go to the client, right? If the answers are not validated, then the recursive servers would drop the answers, right? So you have to make sure that if you are running a recursive name server, make sure that you can do the DNSSEC validation. Again, if you think from a global perspective, currently the DNSSEC validation stats are around 35% globally. So which means about 35% of the DNS queries that are going through DNS servers, about, if you take the number of queries that are going through the DNS servers, about 35% of those are going through DNSSEC validating resolvers. That's the idea, right? So about 35%, we have DNSSEC validation out there. If you are talking about the Asian, statistics in Asia, it's around 30% or so, right? A little bit less than the global stats. So if there are operators, of course, in Thailand as well, we're all in the Asia, right? So if you're not doing DNSSEC validation, try to enable DNSSEC validation. This is quite important. Access controls, especially if you're running resolvers, access controls are something that you should be always considering to avoid things like DDoS, and also you can do things like rate limiting, have some proper access controls. So these are all good practices. Enable queue name minimization. Now, earlier, when I showed my first slide, I said, the recursive resolver would be sending all these queries to root name servers. But the thing is that you don't really have to send the whole query, to the root name servers, because root name servers only need to know the top level domains, right? So you're only getting the top level domain information from the root name servers. So you don't really have to send the full query to the root name server. You can minimize it. So that's what we say, the queue name minimization. If you are running some resolvers, you can enable queue name minimization. Earlier we spoke about, not to run your authoritative name servers and the recursive name servers in the same infrastructure. So make sure you have separate infrastructures. And then at least 2 name servers you should be running even for recursive name servers. We talked about different diversification of software packages that you use, DNS monitoring. If you're also, especially if you're running some public resolvers and so on, you can also consider DOH and DOT. So DOH is DNS over HTTPS, whereas DOT is DNS over TLS. So this is basically if your clients, if they need DNS privacy, right? So you can encrypt those information. Otherwise, if you don't encrypt, then DNS information data goes in the clear packets. So if someone captures that, they can get the metadata around those packets. So that's why, this is something that you can consider, especially if you are running public resolvers and so on. So all in all, this is, typically how your DNS infrastructure look like. There are lots of components. You can see there are different parties involved. There are, stub resolvers that are running in your operating systems, recursive resolvers, we spoke about that. Then there are authoritative name servers. There are registries, registrars, registrants. So there are many parties involved in this DNS ecosystem. So this is also why actually running the DNS infrastructure is quite challenging, because there are so many parties involved. So we have to make sure that everyone doing the right thing. Otherwise, these attacks could happen in different components. So if you can see there are all these red crosses out there. So these are places where the DNS infrastructure can get attacked, where you have a lot of risks. But the thing is that there are also security mechanisms that we can implement to overcome those or mitigate those risks as well, right? So you can see that, for example, I spoke about DOT, DOH. If you want encryption, you can do that. And then if you want some secure zone transfers, there are things called TSIG, transaction signatures, where you can do key-based authentications. DNSSEC, we spoke about that as well, signing your zones, doing the validations and so on. Even when you think of the giving access to your registrars, if you are running some DNS, if you are a registrar, if you are a registry, if you're giving access to your registrant, make sure the access control is also something that you have to really take care, have some proper credential management, right? Maybe, think of things like, two-factor authentications, multi-factor authentications, and so on, because there are lots of these attacks do come through, the registrants are compromised, their credentials are compromised. So the attacker would get into registrar system, and they could, if they get into registrar system, they could change lots of DNS information. They could change their name servers, they could change their mail server information. So a lot of damage can be done as well. And also even they can even change, from one registrar to another registrar. So this is also why that if you are a registrar, you should be having things like registrar locks and so on, okay? So these are all kind of, good practices that you can think of. So the framework that, all these things that I discussed, built in, they are considered in this framework called kindness, right? So if you go to kindness.org, you can do a self-assessment if you want to see how your organization's DNS infrastructure is, whether you are missing something. You can do a self-assessment. which means, you don't have to again put your organization name. If you want to be anonymous, you can still be anonymous and do this self-assessment, and it will give you a rating, where you are not doing the right things, how you can improve, and then basically, based on that, also if you want to convince your management, because sometimes even justifying this to your management is also very difficult, right? So this would also provide you some reports. So you can get these reports and provide it to your management if you want to basically justify the cause, right? And so the first step would be, you can do a self-assessment and see how it goes. But if you want to basically become an ambassador, that means if you want others to follow you, then you can join kindness as a participant, so that it is like a compliance. So we would recognize you as a operator who is compliant with kindness, and then so the others will, and you will also have a good credibility in the community that you are an operator who operates kindness practices, right? So these are things that you can consider, and I think my time is up, so I will stop here. If you have any questions, I can take. I don't know whether if I have time. Otherwise, happy to talk to you during the break and so on. Thank you very much.
A question?
I was wondering if there's a reason why some of the TLD operators have name servers in their authoritative zone, but they don't have those in the root zone. Like some of the TLDs I've seen may have, say, 4 or 5 NS records, but only 3 in the root zone. Is there a technical reason or is it just a mistake?
Yeah, so there are some inconsistencies in fact. So we see that some of the TLDs, one very practical case is that maybe the domain administrator of the CCTLD has left. So the new person really doesn't know much about all that procedures. So they would be updating their zone, but they don't let the IANA know about that change. So there is inconsistent information.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Champika, for your kindness. And the next is still focused on DNS. The next topic is from standard to reality, DNS security in .th operation. Please welcome Titipong Pakinsri from ThaiName server.
Hello, I'm Titipong from ThaiName server. เซสชันนี้ขอเป็นภาษาไทยแล้วกันครับเดี๋ยวขออนุญาตจะนำเสนอbest practice จากที่คุณชัมพิกาพูดนะครับแล้วก็เราจะมานำเสนอในส่วนของ cctld.th นะครับว่าเรานำ best practice ตัวนี้มาใช้งานยังไงบ้างแล้วก็เรามา implement ในระบบของ root zone ของ .th ยังไงรวมถึง resolver ของ .th ที่ทาง ThaiName ดูแลภายใต้ของมูลนิธิด้วยนะครับโอเคเดี๋ยวขอแนะนำตอนเริ่มต้นก็คือผมCTTLD ของ .th เนี่ยครับจะกำหนด policy โดยมูลนิธินะครับ policy ของการจัดการโดเมนส่วนทาง ThaiName server เราเป็น backend registry operator ก็คือเป็นทีมที่ดูแลระบบ DNS จัดการอาจจะมีเรื่องคีย์เรื่องอะไรต่างๆที่เกี่ยวข้องกับ DNS ระบบเขาเรียกรวมเป็นระบบ backend registry ตรงนี้นะครับแล้วเรามี name server ที่ให้บริการอยู่ของ .th ทั้งหมด6ตัวโฟกัสในถ้าชี้ให้ลึกลงไปก็คือโฟกัสในไทย3ตัวแล้วก็โฟกัสทั่วโลกที่เป็นกลุ่มของ Anycast เนี่ยอีก3ตัวนะครับซึ่งก็จะช่วยในเรื่องของการป้องกัน DDoS การป้องกันอะไรต่างๆที่จะทำให้ระบบเราแข็งแรงขึ้นรวมถึงการเซิร์ฟระบบของ .th ทั่วโลกนะครับแล้วก็มีเรื่องของ DNSSEC เมื่อกี้ อย่าง best practice ของทาง root เขา implement DNSSEC ตั้งแต่ต้นทางเราที่เป็นroot ของ .th ที่เป็นTLD แล้วก็ second level SLD เราก็ implement ตัว DNSSEC ทั้ง chain ของเราเรียบร้อยแล้วนะครับแล้วก็เรา implement ที่เป็น dual stack ก็คือเป็น IPv4 v6 ทั้งหมดนะครับโอเคครับต่อไปอันนี้แนะนำตัวของThaiName Server นอกจากเราจะดูแลของ .th แล้วจริงๆเราก็จะดูแลแล้วก็เป็นเหมือนรับช่วยเป็น backend registry ที่สามารถให้บริการโดเมน อื่นได้ที่สมมุติมี brand ต่างๆถ้าในไทยถ้าสนใจที่จะมี เป็นของตัวเองทั้ง ThaiName ก็เป็น backend registry ที่ดูแลตรงนี้อยู่ด้วยนะครับเรามีเซอร์วิสที่เป็นใน application layer มี technical layer ที่เราดูแลก็คือในส่วนของ backend registry มีระบบ monitoring ทั้ง monitor ที่เป็นavailability มี security monitor แล้วก็มี team operation ในการดูแลนะครับโอเคทีนี้ในเรื่องของ best practice ที่กล่าวไปเมื่อสักครู่นี้นะครับผม break down ลงมาเป็น4กลุ่มใหญ่ในมุมมองของงาน ThaiNOG เนี่ยนะครับเราจะแบ่งbest practice นะครับมองเป็น4มุมก็คือในมุมแรกคือ infrastructure diversity ซึ่งใน .th เนี่ยครับเรามี diversity ของ infrastructure ในข้อแรกเนี่ยเราแบ่งทั้งหมดอย่างที่ผมเกริ่นตอนแรกนะครับมีเราทำ DNS server ทั้งหมด6ตัวนะครับมีเป็น unicast 3ตัวที่บอกว่าเป็นกลุ่มของเซิร์ฟเซอร์วิสในประเทศไทยนะครับส่วนอีก3ตัวเป็น Anticast ที่เซิร์ฟทั่วโลกซึ่งทั้งหมดก็จะอยู่คนละ AS number กันทั้งหมดเป็น provider คนละเจ้ากันทั้งหมดนะครับซึ่งก็จะช่วยในเรื่องของความ diversity ของinfrastructure นะครับในส่วนของการ separate infrastructure ในส่วนของ authoritative กับลิขสิทธิ์นะครับเราก็แยกระบบอย่างชัดเจนก็คือเป็นระบบของ authoritative เราก็จะแยกเป็นเครื่องที่เป็นชุดของเซิร์ฟเวอร์ที่ทำงานโดยเฉพาะของกลุ่มนี้แล้วก็ในกลุ่มของลิขสิทธิ์ตรงนี้เราก็จะมีลิขสิทธิ์ในกลุ่มที่เป็น public DNS ด้วย public ลิขสิทธิ์ก็คือตัว DWDM ที่ให้บริการซึ่งตัวเนี้ยเราวางบนเน็ตเวิร์กของ Beaconic เป็นหลักนะครับต่อไปจะเป็นเรื่องของในกลุ่มที่1ก็จะมีเรื่องของเรื่องของซอฟต์แวร์ตรงนี้มีเรื่องของซอฟต์แวร์ซึ่งกลุ่มของซอฟต์แวร์ที่เราให้บริการอยู่เราก็กระจายซอฟต์แวร์ที่ให้บริการทั้งหมดนะครับในกลุ่มที่เราดูแลเองก็จะเป็นซอฟต์แวร์ที่ใช้งานกันมานานนะครับในกลุ่มของเอนจิเนียร์ที่ทำ DNS ก็น่าจะใช้บายกันเป็นหลักส่วนอีก3ตัวเราก็จะเป็นกลุ่มของDNS ที่ใช้ซอฟต์แวร์กลุ่มอื่นนะครับโอเคอันนี้คือภาพรวมของname server ของ .th ที่แจ้งเมื่อสักครู่นี้นะครับก็จะมีทั้งหมด6ตัวตรงนี้ซึ่งทุกท่านที่เข้าเว็บไซต์อยู่ในประเทศไทยก็อาจจะได้ใช้โดยที่อาจจะไม่ได้ไม่เห็นตรงนี้นะครับเพราะเราจะให้บริการอยู่ในเลเวลของroot.th นะครับอันนี้จะเป็นกลุ่มของตัว public DNS นะครับอีก1ตัวที่เราให้บริการอยู่ซึ่งตัวนี้ก็จะให้บริการแบบเน้นทราฟฟิกในประเทศไทยเป็นหลักนะครับก็สามารถลองใช้งานดูได้ครับในกลุ่มที่2ครับเมื่อกี้กลุ่มแรกคือเรื่องของ infrastructure ในกลุ่มที่2จะเป็นเรื่องของ security กับ data integrity นะครับที่จะเน้นเรื่องของ DNSSEC signing ของ .th เองเราก็ทำมาตั้งแต่ต้นแล้วครับก็ต่อเป็น chain of trust กับroot zone ลงมาแล้วเราก็ implement ตัวเป็นเราณปัจจุบันเราเป็นอัลกอริทึม8ซึ่งเป็นชา256ซึ่งก็คือเรายังมองว่าเป็นอัลกอริทึมที่สามารถใช้งานได้ทั่วเข้ากันได้กับระบบทั่วไปนะครับแต่ว่าในยุคถัดไปเราอาจจะต้องมองการอัปเกรดที่เป็นอัลกอริทึมที่ แน่นหนามากขึ้นแข็งแรงมากขึ้นนะครับตามเทรนด์ของโลกนะครับโอเคมีเรื่องของการทำ NSEC 3 support ที่ป้องกันการทำ zone walking protection อะไรพวกนี้ด้วยเราก็ทำเป็นตาม best practice ตรงนี้นะครับzone file integrity การอัปเดตระบบการเข้าถึงไฟล์การเข้าถึงโซนไฟล์ต่างๆเราก็มีการกำหนดบุคคลที่สามารถเข้าถึงโซนไฟล์หรือระบบที่เข้าถึงโซนไฟล์เฉพาะเท่านั้นมีการทำ access control เหล่านี้ไว้ทั้งหมดนะครับแล้วก็นอกจากนั้นเราก็จะมีระบบของการ audit log ด้วยเราก็จะรู้ว่ามีใครเข้าไปถึงโซนไฟล์เราได้นะครับเรื่อง access control ที่ตัว DNS server ตัวนี้ก็จะเป็นเรื่องของการที่จะเข้าถึง DNS server ของเราได้เราจำเป็นที่จะต้องมีการทำ VPN หรือการทำnetwork ที่ระบุต้นทางปลายทางที่ชัดเจนรวมถึงการเข้าถึงเซิร์ฟเวอร์เราก็ใช้two factor เป็นอย่างน้อยก็คือเรื่องของการใช้คีย์ใช้ passphrase แล้วก็ใช้ password เข้าไปที่ตัว password ที่ตัว local ของตัวเซิร์ฟเวอร์ด้วยนะครับส่วนที่3ที่ผมแตกมาเป็นกลุ่มที่3ก็คือเรื่องของการจัดการคีย์ key management นะครับของ .th เองเราก็มีการจะแบ่งของเป็นเรื่องของการจัดเก็บคีย์เราก็จัดเก็บคีย์อยู่ในโซนที่เฉพาะไม่สามารถมีใครเข้าถึงได้มีเพียงแค่ระบบที่ใช้งานคีย์ก็คือระบบของ DNS เท่านั้นที่เข้าถึงได้ไม่มีบุคคลเข้าไปได้นะครับแล้วก็เรื่องของการทำkey lower policy เราก็มีการจัดการที่เป็น automate นะครับตาม policy ตรงนั้นนะครับแล้วก็อาจจะมีการทำpair key ทำ set key ขึ้นมาคู่กันเพื่อให้โซนมันมีการประกาศออกไปก่อนนะครับไม่ให้เชนของ DNS ขาดการ transfer zone จาก root zone ของเรากระจายไปที่ authoritative name server ตัวต่างๆเราก็มีการ transfer แบบระบุต้นทางปลายทางเปิด whitelist IP ให้เครื่องปลายทางกับเครื่องที่ต้นทางเท่านั้นแล้วก็มีการใช้ T6 ในการเป็นคีย์ในการแลกเปลี่ยนนะครับอันนี้เป็นการทดสอบการ transfer zone ให้ดูเบื้องต้นก็เครื่องอื่นอันนี้ลองจากโน้ตบุ๊กมันก็จะไม่สามารถที่จะเข้าถึงเรื่องของการ transfer ได้นะครับทำเป็นตัวอย่างครับซึ่งเราจะแสดงให้เห็นว่าเราล็อกทุกอย่างไว้หมดนะครับจะมีเฉพาะเครื่องต้นทางปลายทางเท่านั้นที่เข้าถึงได้ในกลุ่มที่4นะครับในกลุ่มที่4จะเป็นกลุ่มของเรื่องของ operation นะครับ operation ตรงนี้เรามีเรื่องของการมอนิเตอร์ของระบบ DNS ตลอด24ชั่วโมงแบบ real time นะครับมีการมอนิเตอร์ availability มีการมอนิเตอร์เรื่องของ latency ของแต่ละโนดเพราะ DNS เราเน้นเรื่องความเร็วนะครับถ้า latency มันต่ำเกินกว่าค่าที่กำหนดเราก็จำเป็นที่ต้องแก้ไขเรื่องของ network แล้วเราต้องแยกปัญหาให้ออกว่ามันเป็นปัญหาที่ตัว network เองหรือว่าเป็นตัวที่ server เองตรงนั้นนะครับแล้วก็มีเรื่องระบบของการ alert เรื่องของการ alert ตัว DNS key นะครับว่าเพื่อไม่ให้คีย์มันหมดอายุแล้วทำให้เชนของ DNS โดเมนเรามีปัญหานะครับโอเคในกลุ่มที่2ครับกลุ่มแรกเป็นกลุ่มของ authoritative นะครับกลุ่มที่2นี่จะเป็นกลุ่มของ recursive ก็ขอยกตัวอย่างที่เป็นตัว public ซึ่งอันนี้ก็อาจจะให้ทุกท่านสามารถลองดูได้นะครับก็อาจจะเป็นแบ่งเป็น4กลุ่มเหมือนกันนะครับก็ตรงเนี้ยเราก็แบ่งเป็นเรามีการทำ diversify ของตัวinfrastructure อยู่ซึ่งเราวางอยู่บน network ของ Pakinsri นะครับทั้งหมด3โนดนะครับก็อันนี้แยกอยู่คนละ data center ทั้งหมดแต่เชื่อมต่ออยู่บนnetwork ของ Pakinsri นะครับแล้วก็เครื่องเนี้ยไม่ได้รันตัวname server ของ authoritative เป็นเครื่องที่ทำ recursive public DNS โดยเฉพาะนะครับก็แยกระบบออกมาแล้วก็เรามีการทำ diversify ของซอฟต์แวร์เรามีการทำตัวนี้ก็แจ้งว่าเป็นเราทำที่ตัว by แล้วก็ตัว unbound ที่ทำ public DNS ตัวนี้นะครับโอเคอันนี้ก็เป็นผล ทดสอบเบื้องต้นที่ทำให้ดูว่าเราใช้ IP อะไรอยู่บ้างนะครับโอเคในกลุ่มที่2เรื่อง security นะครับตัว DNSSEC validation enable นะครับตัวนี้เราก็ได้เปิดไว้เป็น default อยู่แล้วนะครับสำหรับตัวนี้ซึ่งเราก็อยากส่งเสริมให้ตัวทุกท่านที่รัน DNSSEC DNS resolver ต่างๆทั้งในองค์กรแล้วก็ที่เป็น public เปิดตัวนี้เพื่อเป็นการป้องกัน DNS cache positioning ซึ่งเป็นการโจมตีทางอินเทอร์เน็ตที่ทำให้ผู้ใช้ไม่รู้ว่าเราเข้าเว็บไซต์ผิดอะไรพวกนี้นะครับแล้วก็ถ้าเป็นในเรื่องของกลุ่มของ Public DNS การทำ Rate Limit สำหรับตัวระบบเป็นสิ่งสำคัญเพราะว่าเราจะได้รับ query ที่ค่อนข้างมหาศาลแล้วมี query ที่ยิงสุ่มเข้ามาทดสอบเราค่อนข้างเยอะเพราะฉะนั้นเราอาจจะต้องมีการทำ Rate Limit ป้องกันเน็ตเวิร์กที่ไม่ถูกต้องหรือว่าการใช้งานที่ผิดปกติด้วยนะครับอันนี้เราก็ทำไว้แล้วก็ป้องกันว่าเซิร์ฟเวอร์ของเราเนี่ยจะเป็นบอทก็คือทำ DNS amplify ออกไปเข้าไปสู่เน็ตเวิร์กของระบบ DNS นะครับและเช่นเดียวกันครับเราก็ใช้ policy เดียวกันในการเข้าถึงตัวเซิร์ฟเวอร์นะครับก็คือมีการใช้กำหนดทั้งการเข้าด้วยคีย์บวกพาสเฟรดแล้วก็การกำหนดเน็ตเวิร์กนะครับแล้วก็การกำหนด VPN ในการเข้าส่วนเรื่องการคอนฟิกเราก็ใช้version control ที่เป็น Git based ในการจัดการตัวคอนฟิกบนระบบนะครับโอเค QNAME minimization ตัวนี้เราก็ต้องเปิดไว้เพราะว่าตาม best practice ที่กล่าวถึงเมื่อสักครู่เราก็ป้องกันในส่วนนี้ไว้ด้วยเพราะว่าเปิดไว้ระบบเราก็จะกลายเป็นตัวที่กระจายโหลดค่อนข้างสูงเข้าไปในระบบนะครับโอเคdata encryption ของ DNS พวก DLT DLS ตัวนี้เราก็ implement ไว้เรียบร้อยแล้วนะครับโอเคอันนี้เป็นผลการทดสอบนะครับของ DLT DLS โอเคในกลุ่มของ monitor ก็เช่นเดียวกันครับในกลุ่ม monitor ของPublic DNS เราก็ใช้ resource ในการ monitor มีทั้ง share resource กับของทาง authoritative แล้วก็แยก resource ในการ monitor กับ authoritative ด้วยนะครับก็คือมีการมี NOC monitor ตัว availability อยู่ตลอดมีการ monitor performance มีการ monitor log ต่างๆเหมือนกันนะครับในภาพเดียวกันครับและสุดท้ายนี่ล้อมาจากทาง ICANN ก็จากที่ได้ลองศึกษาตัว Kai DNS ผมก็ได้ลองไปทำ self test ตัวเนี้ยของกลุ่มของ .th เองก็ตามคือเราเข้าไปในเว็บไซต์ของเขาแล้วมันจะมีดรอปดาวน์ให้เราเลือกว่าเป็น authoritative หรือเป็น recursive เราก็ค่อยตอบคำถามไปทีละข้อซึ่งในมุมของ .th เองเรา implement ทั้งหมดไว้อยู่แล้วนะครับก็เลยก็สามารถอธิบายได้ดังภาพนะครับก็จะเป็นทั้งหมดที่อธิบายตั้งแต่ข้างต้นนะครับทีนี้ที่แชร์มาถึงตรงนี้ครับก็อยากให้ทุกคนเห็นว่าตัว root zone ของ .th เองของประเทศไทยเราเองก็ตามนะครับเรา implement บนพื้นฐานของ best practice ที่ทาง ICANN แนะนำนะครับเพราะฉะนั้นเรื่องความมั่นคงปลอดภัยของระบบเราค่อนข้างสูงนะครับแล้วก็เราก็จะเน้นเรื่อง security ของระบบอยู่ทีนี้อยากจะเชิญชวนทุกคนนะครับในที่นี้ที่มีโดเมนของ .th เองก็ตามที่เป็น level 3นะครับเรื่องของ DNSSEC มันเป็น chain of trust นะครับเมื่อ level บนสุดที่เป็น root implement DNSSEC เรียบร้อยแล้วthird second TLD second level ที่ THNIC ดูแลก็ implement เรียบร้อยแล้วนะครับก็ทีนี้อยากให้ผู้ดูแลโดเมนทั้งหลายนะครับ implement ตัว DNSSEC เข้าไปที่ domain name เองของทุกท่านนะครับเพราะว่าในกลุ่มของ resolver เองก็ตามก็อยากให้เปิดตัว validation เพื่อป้องกันตัว network ของเรา network ของประเทศเรานะครับให้มั่นคงแข็งแรงนะครับนะครับทีนี้ทางมูลนิธิเองก็ตามหรือทาง ThaiNOG8 ก็ตามนะครับเรา implement ตัวเว็บไซต์ตัว check DNSSEC ตัวนี้ขึ้นมาเพื่อให้ทุกท่านเข้าไปตรวจสอบเว็บไซต์แล้วก็ resolver ที่ตัวเองใช้งานอยู่เป็นพื้นฐานเบื้องต้นนะครับให้ลองวิเคราะห์ตัวระบบของตัวเอง อันนี้เป็นระดับเบื้องต้นนะครับถ้าเป็นระดับที่เราต้องการระดับเอนจิเนียร์ที่ต้องการแก้ปัญหาอาจจะต้องไปที่เครื่องมือของต่างประเทศอีกชั้นหนึ่งนะครับก็แนะนำไว้ให้ลองทดสอบกันดูนะครับน่าจะประมาณนี้ครับทันเวลาพอดีครับขอบคุณครับมีคำถามไหมครับ
มีคำถามไหมฮะโอเคนะ
โอเคขอบคุณครับ
ขอบคุณคุณทิพย์อาจารย์
ครับ
เชิญเลยครับ
ขออนุญาตถามนิดนึงนะครับพอดีกำลังจะสอบทั้ง manner ทั้ง kindness ก็เลยอยากรู้ว่าไอ้ process ในการที่จะให้ได้ผ่าน kindness เนี่ยยุ่งยากมากไหมอันนี้ไม่นับไอ้พาร์ทที่เราจะต้องทำทางฝั่งของเรา
เป็นเซลล์เทสครับเพราะฉะนั้นก็คือเราทดสอบที่ตัวเราเอง
โอเค
ครับเป็นเซลล์เทสติ้งครับ
ครับ
แค่เราดูว่าเรา implement ตาม best practice พวกนี้หรือยังครับ
ขอบคุณครับ
ครับผม
มีอีกพี่เป็นสีแล้วครับเป็นสี
ค่ะ
ครับ
Champika can Thai name server be under kindness like you said that we can be the ambassador thank you so should be the first in Thailand and we recommend or ask everybody every operator here to turn on the DNSSEC validation and do the signing process. So actually, we with NCSA Thailand is trying to promote this also in Thailand this year. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
ขอบคุณครับขอบคุณอีกครั้งครับสำหรับคุณที่พงศ์นะครับสำหรับเรื่อง DNS next อาจารย์ชยาโอเคเดี๋ยวไว้ติดต่อกันทีหลังนะครับ Okay, for the next topic is we move from DNS to the 30 bucks attack box inside the Android TV botnet ecosystem. Please welcome Jérôme Meyer from Nokia.
So hi everyone, my name is Jérôme and I'm a security researcher at Nokia Deepfield. I spent most of my days looking at DDoS and a bit more specifically looking at what is actually sending DDoS, which means these days botnets. Since we have, I think, a few DNS people in the room, anyone familiar with that domain name? So that's a real domain name that was associated with one of the big botnets of last year. It is actually a postal physical US mailing address, and it is often the case with a lot of those DDoS botnet operators. They dox their competition, so that's one real address. And at some point in October last year, for a couple of days, this domain name was number one in front of google.com from the perspective of Cloudflare Radar. So this is the visibility through the Cloudflare public resolver in terms of number of queries. They fixed, or at least they modified a bit the leaderboard so that this would be hidden. But this is just to show the impact and the scale of some of the large botnets that can generate this amount of queries to this public resolver here. And by the way, so this is so the SU top-level domain. This is always a bit amusing to me, at least. The SU is for Soviet Union, so it is still a CCTLD that is for the Soviet Union, and it is one of the favorites of some of these botnet operators. When I look at DDoS, so when we at Nokia at least look at DDoS, we tend to have a lot of attack samples. And to us, this is kind of what it looks like, at least one of the things that we look. And that was from 2024, before things changed in the following year. So to us, this is a list of the top source IP addresses that are involved in one of the attacks that we saw in May 2024. And in orange, this is when we know that there is some kind of vulnerable device behind that IP address. It can be a security camera, it can be a compromised router, plenty of IoT devices that can be exploited by those botnet operators. And in red, this is when we have actually seen that IP address in a recent DDoS attack. So this was very, very typical, at least for several years in the past. We were seeing a lot of IoT devices, a lot of them we already knew about, and we see them all the time. And then in 2025, we started to see this at the beginning of the year. So no IoT device, nothing that we had seen in recent DDoS attacks, but we started to see those IP addresses send volumetric DDoS attacks. And those purple tags here, those are indicators of residential proxy exit nodes. So this is, at first, we didn't really know what to think, and then we started to see it happen more and more frequently, and we started to see some attacks that were really bigger than anything we'd seen before. So when we look a bit at the proxy, so the residential proxy problem, at least when I take the perspective of a network operator, it is not something that we had to care about too much in the past, because it was mostly something that the abuse teams cared about, but not really something that mattered at the level of the network. And then in 2024, we started to see some DDoS operators use VPNs and residential proxies. The first ones really were No Name, which is a pro-Russian activist group that is mostly attacking a lot of European targets, but also in some cases Japan and some Korean targets as well. And they started to use those types of proxy exit nodes. But then really, it really changed in 2025. So when we started to see that, as I showed before, initially we started to call it risk hydra, which is the phenomenon that those proxy exit nodes were suddenly starting to be compromised and then send this volumetric DDoS traffic. And throughout 2025, we saw a rapid succession of different botnets, each one bigger than the one before it. And in terms of the scale of the problem, we started to quantify what was the number of potentially vulnerable proxy exit nodes, and this is in the hundreds of millions of devices. So what is fueling this massive number of proxy exit nodes? And this is, as very often these days, there is a simple answer, which is AI. And it's maybe not in the sense that we expected. AI has created a massive demand for this proxy market, because of course we know that there are a lot of websites that now take some measures to prevent AI companies from scraping websites. And one of the methods that some AI companies pick to get around those restrictions is to use residential proxy provider services, which means that they can funnel the traffic through millions of residential IP addresses and therefore circumvent the protections that some of those websites are putting in place. We have seen evidence of some AI companies, not all, that are sending constantly hundreds of gigabits per second of traffic to websites through those proxy providers. And then, of course, the other thing that is contributing to the increase of DDoS traffic is that it turns out you all have wonderful marketing departments which are increasing the upstream bandwidth every year. And this is one, I mean, there are not many applications that benefit from having 1 gig upstream connectivity, but DDoS is one of them. So DDoS operators love to have gigi upstream because that means, of course, that it increases the impact of their botnet. So if I summarize a little bit here, we saw really a shift of the type of DDoS that we saw between 2024 and before. And then last year was really the year everything changed, where we saw instead of having a lot of IoT devices, we started to see those purple tags that I showed you before. So lots of proxy exit nodes. And it turns out that many of them are actually some Android TV boxes that a lot of people buy for somewhere between $30 and sometimes a bit more. So there are some more expensive ones. If they offer, for example, some pirated content in the US, those will be a bit more expensive. But there are tens of millions of them, and many of them ship compromised from the factory. So even if you do a reset of that Android TV box, so there will still be this proxy software, and it will still be exploitable by those operators. The big difference also is that this is not something we can scan. So this is something, a lot of those will be behind CGNAT. Almost all of them will be also behind NAT, so the home NAT. So it is more challenging to really see exactly what is the device behind it. When I look at so I said, no, 2025 was the year that DDoS changed. So for a long time, this is what DDoS was. So each bubble is one DDoS attack that we saw. So you can see it was pretty rare to get attacks that are in the terabit per second range. And then last year happened. So I was not kidding when I said that it was different. We saw first with those initial botnets like Wrapperbots, and then later Isuru, and then Kimulf, which is the one that I will come back to in a minute. You have probably heard about and you read those articles where we were mentioning 30 terabit per second attacks. This is why. So this is why, and this is really also, this shows you the frequency of change from last year. So this is, I think there was a little bit of, or not a little bit, there was a lot of concerns for many of our customers last year because there are not many networks that can actually sustain a 30 terabit per second traffic, let alone a DDoS attack. So those are the three main botnets that succeeded each other last year. So just to illustrate a bit the increase of scale after each step. So Wrapperbot was one in early 2025. And at the time, it was the largest botnet that we had ever seen from a DDoS perspective. So somewhere between 30 to 50, 60,000 bots. It was taken down, so there was law enforcement action. The US authorities managed to seize the command and control infrastructure in the US in August. But then all the devices that were in Wrapperbot were then compromised by Isuru, which was another of those botnets. So Isuru managed to grow also another order of magnitude in terms of number of bots. And then Kimulf then happened at the end of last year. So it was in the October timeframe. So this is why we saw this domain name at the beginning of the presentation. That was from Kimulf. And that was one of the ways that they were compromising those Android TV boxes by resolving that domain name, which was resolving actually to a private IP address, which I will explain in a bit. So Kimulf, the way that it works, it really, I think, took many of the security community by surprise. Because first, it was by far the largest DDoS botnet that we have ever seen so far. There was some overlap between Kimulf and Isuru. So there were some of the same people that were behind those two botnets. It was the one responsible for those 30 plus terabit per second attacks. Initially, so it used DNS for for example, the domain that I mentioned earlier. So that was one of the things it was using. But more recently, so since November, December last year, it started using another type of DNS-like system, which is ENS. So ENS is a DNS-like system that is based on the Ethereum blockchain. And this is what you can see here, which this is a screenshot of the ENS record for one of the domains from Kimwolf. There is some information that I blocked out because it is doxing, so it is public information from other security researchers that the botnet operator published in order to retaliate against the publication. But there is information about the command and control infrastructure, and this is how they communicate today with some of the other botnets. This information about the C2s, it is through records in ENS, and also a bit more recently in the Solana domain system, which is a bit similar to ENS. Today, so at least pre-law enforcement action in March, there were around 3 million bots for Kimwolf. It's since, of course, reduced in size after the law enforcement action from March 19th. There are, however, more botnets that are a bit copying the approach from Kimwolf. And before I get to that, just to explain, and I won't be able to do it justice, but the way that Kimwolf managed to take over those millions of devices is actually pretty simple when you think about it. It was through the official residential proxy providers, those that you can buy traffic from, anywhere, so you have hundreds of them that are available. The largest one is IPIDEA, which is a wholesale provider. They were resolving different types of domain names. This is one of them. The long one at the beginning of the presentation, it was another. This domain name is resolving to _0, which means that the proxy layer on the device was then giving access to the device itself. And then, because of course the proxy provider was not blocking those requests, and then once the operator had access to the device itself, many of them have an unauthenticated ADB, so that's the Android debug bridge that is accessible, and that provides root access to the device. And of course, once you have root access on that device, it's game over. So this is really pretty straightforward. I really encourage, if you're interested, to look at this blog post from Sentient, who was the original public research on this vulnerability, that did a great job to disclose it to the community. I won't maybe go into too much detail here, but just to show you the escalation of the tonnage of those attacks from Kimwolf and similar types of botnets. We saw many tens of terabit per second attacks. It's quieted down a bit since this year after the law enforcement action. What was interesting, though, I think from a network operator perspective, is those were not super sophisticated, despite what some news outlets say. These are pretty brute force attacks where it's massive UDP floods, same packet size. It doesn't really matter because they have so much traffic to send that in the end they didn't need to do something super clever. They just sent a ton of traffic to the victim. Another example of, so this is part of what we do also, we run the malware to observe what it does. And we see, for example, in this case for Kimwolf, it was generating both layer 7 proxy relay commands to, in this case, you can see it is trying to log in to Microsoft Live to basically take some stolen credentials and trying to train them on the Microsoft production servers. And then, of course, on the right, this is the volumetric flood, which was also very typical. So it was an interesting business model in a way, because the botnet operator was operating both their own proxy service for criminals, as well as this DDoS for hire service that was that was basically offering them two different revenue streams. What this means for us, also within the security community and the network operator community, I think, is that we still see an increase of the number of DDoS bots compared to before. For a long time, for many years, we were tracking around about 1 million active DDoS bots. That was relatively stable. Since October last year, it's been almost a linear growth of DDoS bots. We are now at roughly 9 million, I think, when I looked this morning and counting. So it is still increasing because ultimately the root cause of the issue is really the proxy providers, which for most of them are still not patched for the vulnerability that Syntheant reported. So they can still be exploited by a lot of those botnet operators, which explains really that this is still continuing, not with Kimolf necessarily, but with other botnets that are copying the approach of Kimolf, and with, of course, some help from their some AI assistance in the coding of their botnets. One thing I want to stress and to mention is that, of course, it's bad enough if you are the target of a 30 terabit per second flood, but there is also impact, and we've seen that with some of our customers, especially in Latin America, because that's where there are a lot of those proxy boxes with a high concentration of those devices. We have had discussions with some customers for which the infrastructure was actually starting to fail because of the outbound DDoS traffic that they were getting on their network. So for example, they had some CGNet gateways that were starting to fail because suddenly there was a UDP flood from Kimolf or some other botnets that was causing issues on the connection tracker on the CGNet node. So that can have an impact on the network itself, on the origin of the traffic, and also even for tier 1 backbone customers. It may not be too much to carry 30 terabit per second on their backbone, but the ingress and the egress routers, this is where you have really a bottleneck. Maybe I won't have time to go into a lot of additional details. Kimolf was the first of those botnets. There are now at least a dozen that we are tracking that are exploiting the same vulnerability. Some of them have some interesting features, at least interesting in the research sense, where, for example, CCBot, which is one we discovered earlier this year, is also exploiting the same vulnerability, but is additionally speaking the HDMI CEC protocol, which is the protocol that your TV speaks, for example. So it can detect when the TV is off or on. If it wanted, so it doesn't do it, I think, but it could turn your TV off. It would kind of, I think, give it away. But it is a capability that they have. More concerningly, so CCBot also has the capability to do a scan of the LAN. So for example, there can be a C2 attack command that we ask the device to do a local scan of the LAN. So if, for example, in the home, to do to scan the entire /24, for example, of the private range, and to do some ARP mapping to understand what are the devices that it may also be able to compromise later on. So we have a lot more details and research at this public repo. I'm happy also to talk about it at the break, but just wanted to show you this. One thing I think that we are also starting to discuss with customers is it's important, and this is almost my last slide, so it matters to block C2 traffic for those DDoS botnets. This is from a few weeks ago with one of our Brazilian customers who was impacted by Kimolf. So we started to implement some dynamic C2 blocking for those botnets. And the effect was really stark. As soon as we started to implement that blocking policy, there was almost no outbound DDoS traffic anymore, so it was almost down to zero, effectively. And this is really something that we encourage folks to do. So think about the impact, of course, of the wider internet, but also on your own network, because that may become an issue, as it has for our Brazilian customers. And the ability to disrupt C2 traffic at the edge is something that is really worth considering. So thank you. I'm a bit over time, I apologize, and happy to take any questions.
Any questions?
Thank you.
Jérôme, I have a question.
Just simple question. You mentioned it's an outbound,
yes,
right? So just wonder where is the observer. So what is actually the target of that DDoS?
So can you come in?
Actually the target of
yes,
that DDoS. So first is outbound, right? So where is the observer? In which direction?
So this is on the peering boundary from one operator. So when they implemented, so they were looking at peering input and peering output. So this is peering output. So what traffic they are sending to the internet?
Somebody else.
Yes,
Yeah.
to somebody else, right? Because most of the attacks, they are really, I mean, they basically spray a lot of different targets, but many of them are common targets. You know, specific AS, we see a lot of Microsoft, we see a lot of gaming servers. So those are outside the network. So either with the peering, with their peering partners, or with transit, right? So this will be blocking all of that traffic outbound.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jérôme. And before we continue, I would like to ask our speakers for this session on the stage again, and I would like to invite Dr. Pakinsri on the stage to give the souvenir for this session speakers. Tashi and Champika and Kun Titipong and Jérôme. Thank you, everyone. And now we have a coffee break about 20 minutes. And